Somewhere in the world right now, there's a stone block weighing over 1,000 tons, sitting in a quarry, and no one can fully explain how ancient builders planned to move it. There's a language carved into clay tablets that modern linguists still can't read. There are temples aligned to stars with a precision that shouldn't have been possible without instruments that hadn't been invented yet. Historians build careful timelines. They date the tools, the trade routes, the rise and fall of empires, and they teach it as settled fact. Then, on one excavation, on one specific day, a team dug into the ground, expecting to confirm what everyone already believed. What they found instead didn't fit. It pushed a timeline back further than it was supposed to go, and nobody has fully explained why. Before the one that rewrote the timeline, there are 20 other places where the past simply refuses to explain itself. The story starts with a single ancient text, a trade city so wealthy that Roman and Greek writers described it in near mythical terms. They called it the City of 1,000 Pillars, built on the incense trade that once moved through the desert. And then, according to legend, it vanished. Swallowed by sand, the story goes, as punishment for the pride of its people. For centuries, that was all anyone had. A legend, a warning, a name repeated by traders and scholars who couldn't agree if the place had ever existed at all. Explorers tried to find it anyway. They crossed one of the harshest deserts on Earth on foot and by camel, following scraps of old routes and older rumors, and every single one of them came back empty-handed. The ground wasn't giving up anything. Satellite images from orbit would eventually catch something the ground search never could. In the 1980s, a research team turned to a technology that had never been used this way before: imaging radar, flown on a space shuttle, capable of seeing through something the human eye can't: dry sand. The radar beams passed straight through the desert's upper layer and bounced back off what was buried underneath. What came back on the data wasn't just dunes, it was lines. Faint, straight, deliberate paths cutting across the empty land. Patterns that looked less like nature and more like roads that didn't exist on any modern map. Researchers matched those lines to old caravan routes described in ancient texts, and the paths converged on one location, a place with nothing visible on the surface. So they packed their gear and went there. What they dug up matched the legend in one detail that nobody expected. The dig confirmed collapsed walls under the dunes, mud brick foundations laid out in a grid, and pottery shards that matched the pattern described in the old caravan texts almost line for line. Traders had written about a walled outpost with a market at its center, and that's roughly where the market turned up. For a moment, it looked like the legend had just been proven true in the dirt. But the carbon dating came back off by nearly 200 years from the timeline the texts implied. The layout matched, the location matched, the date didn't, and in archaeology, that gap is enough to keep a label off a site permanently. So the team published their findings as consistent with the legend, not as confirmation of it. That phrase does a lot of quiet work in academic papers. Not every expert agrees on what was actually found. 300 miles from that dune site, a different excavation turned up something harder to explain. Clay bowls sat on stone hearths, with food still hardened inside them, meals that were never finished. Grinding stones lay mid-motion, grains scattered around them like someone had simply let go. Loom weights hung untouched from a wooden frame that had long since rotted away, but the weights themselves stayed exactly where the last hand left them. Sandals sat paired by the doorway of one home, as if their owner meant to come right back. There's no sign of packing, no carts loaded and left behind, no valuables stripped from the walls. People who plan to leave take their coins and their tools. Whatever happened there, it happened fast enough that no one had time to pack. The first assumption was war. Abandoned settlements usually mean an army came through. So researchers checked for the evidence that raid or siege would leave behind. There was none of it. No mass grave, no scattered weapons, no layer of ash and char, marking a fire set on purpose, the kind that shows up unmistakably in soil samples from sites that were actually sacked. Skeletal remains found nearby showed no blade wounds, no blunt trauma, nothing consistent with a fight. Whoever or whatever emptied that town left no mark of violence at all. If it wasn't violence, the next explanation is stranger than most people expect. Climate cores pulled from lake beds near Mohenjo-daro tell a different story. Around 1900 BCE, monsoon patterns shifted east across the subcontinent. Rivers that fed the Indus system began to dry or change course, and agricultural output would have collapsed within a generation. The timeline matches. Pottery styles simplify in the final occupation layers. Granaries show less use, and there's a slow decline in imported goods. It looks like a city starving in stages, not fleeing in panic. But the climate explanation has a flaw no one's resolved. If 20,000 people migrated over months or years, their bones should appear somewhere along those routes. Burial sites, temporary camps, anything. The archaeological record shows nothing at scale. If everyone left, the question is where 20,000 people actually went. Some researchers argue they dispersed into smaller villages to the south and east, blending into existing populations. Ceramic styles from late Indus sites do appear in later settlements hundreds of miles away, but those fragments account for hundreds of people, maybe a few thousand, not an entire urban center. Others suggest the population moved north into the foothills or west toward the Persian plateau. Excavations in those regions have turned up trade beads and seals with Indus script, proof of contact. But no mass grave sites, no sudden population boom in neighboring cultures, no new cities that absorbed the exodus. The Indus Valley civilization didn't collapse in a day. It faded across 300 years, its writing system forgotten, its urban centers abandoned, its people absorbed into a record that never wrote their names. Formally, archaeologists list the case as unresolved. Some mysteries aren't about people who vanished. They're about people who were never meant to be found at all. In 1950, two Danish brothers, cutting peat in a bog near Silkeborg, pulled up what they thought was a recent murder victim. The body was intact, skin darkened but whole, facial features visible, a rope still knotted around the neck. Police arrived and called in an archaeologist. The remains were 2,400 years old. Tolland Man is one of hundreds of bog bodies recovered across northern Europe, from Ireland to Poland. The peat preserves them in ways dry ground never could. Hair, fingerprints, stomach contents, even the expression on their faces. Some look like they died yesterday. But these aren't accidental drownings. Graubaul Man had his throat cut ear to ear. Lindo Man was struck twice on the head, strangled with a cord, then had his throat opened before being pushed face down into the water. Eyed Girl, found in the Netherlands, was stabbed and strangled, a woven band still twisted tight around her neck. The preservation is explained by chemistry. The deaths are not. A bog isn't just wet ground. It's low in oxygen and soaked in tannic acid, which stops the bacteria that normally break a body down. Instead, the acid tans the skin like leather and pulls the calcium out of the bones, leaving them soft and pliable, sometimes centuries later. That's why researchers could still examine Wide Girl's body in detail 2,000 years after she died. And what they found wasn't one cause of death. It was several, stacked on top of each other. She'd been stabbed near the collarbone. She'd been strangled with that woven band. Some researchers even point to signs of a skull fracture before either of those wounds happened. No single injury explains it. Together, they raise a harder question than any one wound could. One theory would connect these deaths to something far larger than any single murder. Bog bodies like Wide Girl aren't isolated. Across northern Europe, over 100 have surfaced from the peat, many showing the same pattern: overkill, more violence than seems necessary to end a life. Two theories have dominated the debate for decades. The first is ritual sacrifice. Bodies are found near ancient causeways and boundary markers, some with last meals of ceremonial grain porridge, suggesting a deliberate offering to the land or the gods. The second is punishment. Roman writers describe Germanic tribes executing adulterers and traitors by drowning them in bogs, bodies pinned down with branches. Both theories have physical evidence behind them. Neither has enough to close the case. And radiocarbon dating has only complicated things further. Some bog bodies found meters apart turn out to be separated by hundreds of years, not a single event, but a practice repeated across generations. That gap in time would only make the next mystery harder to explain. Move from the bogs of northern Europe to a cave wall, and the mystery changes shape entirely. Carved into the stone ceiling are clusters of dots, precisely spaced, that line up with constellations still visible in the night sky today. The Pleiades, Orion's belt, patterns early astronomers would later chart with instruments. What unsettles researchers isn't that ancient people watched the sky, it's how accurately this was recorded. The spacing between the carved points mirrors the actual angular distance between the stars, the kind of precision you'd expect from careful, repeated observation, not guesswork. No telescope existed yet, no written mathematics as we'd recognize it, just eyes, memory, and stone. If the accepted age of the carving is correct, someone was mapping the sky with a level of exactness that shouldn't have been possible. Dating this object would split researchers into two camps that still haven't reconciled. Conventional dating puts the carving within the range archaeologists expect for tools and technique of that era. But one independent method, run by a separate team years later, pushed the timeline back by several thousand years. That's not a rounding error. That's a gap wide enough to put the carving before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before almost everything we associate with organized civilization. The two dating camps use different physical evidence, and neither has fully accepted the other's numbers. One side points to erosion patterns on the stone. The other points to the layer of sediment it was buried under, and what that layer says about when the carving stopped being exposed to open air. No new discovery has broken the tie. The debate has sat frozen for over a decade, with both papers still cited, still contested, still unresolved. If the early date is right, it changes what we think ancient people even understood. Strip away the debate over age for a moment and look at what the alignment actually does. On one specific day, light or shadow lines up with the carving in a way that can't be accidental. Modern astronomers ran the geometry backward, plotting the sky as it would have looked from that exact spot centuries ago. The math held. The event it marks isn't an everyday sunrise. It's something that happens once every few hundred years, a rare configuration that would have taken generations of watching to even notice, let alone predict. That means whoever carved this wasn't reacting to something they saw once. They were tracking a pattern that unfolds slower than a human lifetime. No one left a note explaining why it mattered enough to carve in stone. No tablet, no inscription, no oral tradition passed down clearly enough to survive translation. The people who made this left behind the object itself, and nothing else, which means every explanation for it is a guess, dressed up as a theory. One camp argues it's ritual, tied to a belief system we've lost entirely, a marker for something sacred that only mattered to the people who built it. Another camp argues it's practical, a working calendar, for planting or migration, stripped of any spiritual weight at all. Both theories fit the evidence. Neither can be proven. And that silence, total and deliberate, or simply the result of time erasing everything but stone, is its own kind of unsettling. The next mystery isn't about what a symbol meant, it's about who was even capable of making it. In 1926, a museum curator in Central Europe logged a small iron dagger pulled from a burial site, and for decades it sat in storage as an oddity nobody wanted to touch. The blade showed almost no rust. Iron from that period corrodes fast, crumbling into flakes within a century. Yet this one still held an edge sharp enough to cut cloth. Curators assumed someone had swapped in a modern replica somewhere along the way, a prank or a mislabeled inventory item. The tomb around it dated to roughly 1300 BC, centuries before ironsmithing was supposed to exist in that region at any real scale. For decades, the dagger just sat there, too strange to display, too old to dismiss. Nobody wanted to be the one to call it real and be wrong, so it waited in a drawer, unexamined, until the equipment finally existed to look at it properly. A metallurgy lab would eventually confirm something the museum had assumed was a modern hoax. The lab ran X-ray fluorescence first, a scan that reads the elemental makeup of metal without damaging it. The results ruled out forgery immediately. The alloy's trace impurities, the exact mix of nickel and cobalt bound into the iron, matched patterns only found in metal smelted from meteoric ore, not mined and refined the way local smiths worked at the time. Then came the microscopy. Cross-sections revealed hammering patterns consistent with cold forging at low, controlled temperatures, a technique that demands a level of heat control historians didn't think existed in that culture for another 500 years. The grain structure was uniform in a way that sloppy, primitive forging simply can't produce. Radiocarbon dating on organic residue sealed inside the hilt confirmed the burial context was genuine. No tampering, no swap. The object was exactly as old as the tomb around it. If local craftsmen didn't make it, the question becomes who did. The leading theory points to trade. Meteoric iron was prized and passed hand to hand across enormous distances long before anyone was mining it locally, and a handful of similar blades have turned up in graves thousands of kilometers apart, all sharing that same telltale meteoric signature. Under this view, the dagger wasn't made nearby at all. It arrived as a finished, priceless import, maybe generations before it was buried. A smaller group of researchers pushes back on that entirely. They argue the forging technique itself, not just the raw material, shows signs of independent local innovation, meaning some smith in that region may have figured out advanced ironworking on their own, centuries ahead of the accepted timeline. Most mainstream historians reject that reading outright. The evidence, they say, is circumstantial at best. No excavation has turned up a workshop, tools, or a second attempt anywhere nearby. Whoever made it, or received it, left no trace of the process behind, only the finished blade. Not every strange find gets even that much of an explanation. In November 1922, a team funded by a British lord broke through a plaster seal in the Valley of the Kings, one that hadn't been touched in over 3,000 years. Behind it sat the tomb of a minor pharaoh, nearly intact, gold catching torchlight for the first time since the reign of Ramesses himself. Inside the doorway, some accounts describe a clay tablet with a warning inscribed on it, though no photograph of it survives, and its wording depends on who you ask. The lead archaeologist's pet canary was reportedly swallowed by a cobra the same day the tomb was opened, a detail the local workers didn't treat lightly. Within weeks, people connected to the digs started dying, or so the story goes. The financier who bankrolled the excavation died in April 1923, 5 months after the seal broke, from blood poisoning that started as an infected mosquito bite on his cheek. Cairo's lights reportedly flickered out at the exact moment he stopped breathing, according to newspapers eager for a headline. His half-brother died months later from what was called blood poisoning as well. A radiologist who had X-rayed the mummy died in 1924. An American financier connected to the dig died by suicide, leaving behind a note that mentioned a curse he believed was closing in on him. By 1935, newspapers had tallied over a dozen deaths tied to the tomb, each one folded into a growing legend. Decades later, scientists would offer an explanation that had nothing to do with curses. In the 1990s, researchers proposed that sealed tombs like this one could harbor Aspergillus mold spores and bacterial toxins, dormant for millennia in the dark, waiting for fresh air to reactivate them. Inhaled in a confined stone chamber, those spores can trigger lung hemorrhaging and organ failure in someone with a weakened immune system, which the financier already had after years of poor health. A 2002 study in the British Medical Journal tracked 58 people present at the tomb's opening. Only 8 died within a decade of the discovery. The rest lived an average lifespan for the era, including the archaeologist who led the dig, who survived another 17 years. The math never supported a curse, just selective memory and a press that liked the story better than the statistics. The next site has no myth attached to it at all, just a puzzle nobody has solved. In the Peruvian desert, more than 800 straight lines and 300 geometric shapes cover 450 square kilometers of barren ground. The Nazca lines were etched into pale soil between 500 BCE and 500 CE, some figures stretching over 370 meters from end to end. A spider, a monkey, a hummingbird, each drawn with a single unbroken line. The Nazca people had no written language and left no records explaining why they made them. From ground level, the lines look like shallow trenches and random scrapes. From 300 meters up, they resolve into perfect geometric forms and animal shapes. The culture that drew them never flew. Archaeologists confirmed the method in the 1980s by replicating smaller figures using wooden stakes and rope, the tools the Nazca had. The precision held across kilometers of desert with no sightlines, no way to check their work from above. Whoever made these knew they'd never see the full shape from the ground. Workers removed the top layer of reddish pebbles to expose lighter soil beneath, then outlined each figure by digging trenches 10 to 15 centimeters deep. The dry climate preserved them for 2,000 years. Radiocarbon dating of wooden stakes left in the ground confirmed the timeline, and pottery shards match known Nazca ceramics. The trapezoids align with near-perfect angles. The spirals maintain constant curvature over hundreds of meters. There's no evidence of scaffolding, no elevated platforms, no vantage points within walking distance that would reveal the full design. They worked from plans they couldn't verify. Some figures sit on hilltops, visible from adjacent ridges, but most sprawl across flat desert with no natural overlook. Commercial flights didn't spot them until 1927. For 1,400 years after the Nazca vanished, the lines sat unrecognized, visible only to birds and empty sky. One theory says they weren't meant for human eyes at all. Astronomer Maria Reich spent 50 years mapping the lines and proposed they functioned as an astronomical calendar. She identified alignments between certain lines and solstice sunrises, and correlations between animal figures and constellations visible in 500 CE. But only 20% of lines match celestial events, and the rest point nowhere significant. Archaeologist Johann Reinhard argued they were sacred pathways for ritual processions, connecting the figures to mountain gods and water worship. Pottery and offerings cluster near some line intersections, and Nazca religion centered on rain deities. But processions don't explain the figures designed to be seen from above, not walked through. A 2019 study using satellite imaging found many lines terminate at ancient water sources or follow underground aquifers. In a desert averaging under 4 millimeters of rain per year, marking water would matter. Yet the animal geoglyphs don't align with water, and some lines run perpendicular to the nearest source. Each theory fits part of the evidence and fails the rest. 3 explanations, none complete, and the Nazca left no text to settle it. The desert preserved the lines, but erased the reason. The next mystery isn't drawn on the ground, it's carved straight through solid rock. In 1963, in Turkey's Cappadocia region, a man was renovating his house when he knocked down a wall and found a room that shouldn't have existed. Behind it was a tunnel. Behind the tunnel, more rooms, cut straight into soft volcanic rock. That was Derinkuyu. Excavation eventually revealed 18 levels dropping over 60 meters underground, with space and air enough for an estimated 20,000 people, plus livestock and supplies, to live for months without surfacing. Tool marks on the walls suggest work done with basic hand implements, on stone that hard labor alone doesn't easily explain at that scale. And the discovery itself was almost comedy. The man who found it wasn't looking for a city, he was chasing a chicken through a wall. Once archaeologists got inside, the city stopped looking like a hideout and started looking like a home. Ventilation shafts run the full 60-meter depth, over 50 of them, engineered so air could circulate through every level without a single fire's smoke choking the lowest floors. There are wells cut deep enough to reach water even if the surface was under siege. There are stables for animals, kept separate from living quarters. There are wine and oil presses, storage rooms, and communal spaces, including a barrel-vaulted chapel on one of the lower floors. None of that fits a place built for a few desperate weeks underground. Wells, livestock management, food processing, all of it points to people who expected to stay a long time, maybe generations. But something about the earliest levels doesn't match who's credited with building it. The standard credit goes to the Phrygians, around the 8th century BC, later expanded by Byzantine Christians hiding from raiders. That timeline works fine for the upper floors. It falls apart the deeper you go. Tool marks on the lowest levels look different, cruder in some places, more advanced in others, and geologists studying the rock-cutting technique have argued the deepest sections could predate the Phrygians by centuries. If that's right, someone was already living under this stretch of Turkey before the civilization history books hand the city to. No inscriptions from that earliest layer have turned up to say who they were. Whoever cut those first rooms left the rock, and nothing else. And an earlier hand-shaping stone shows up again in the next mystery, half a world away. At Baalbek in Lebanon, 3 stones sit in a temple platform, each weighing roughly 800 tons. They were quarried a quarter-mile away, dragged uphill, and set into place with joints so tight a blade won't fit between them. The Romans built on top of these blocks, but they didn't cut them. A 4th stone still lies in the quarry, partially carved. It weighs 1,650 tons, making it the largest worked stone block ever found. No crane today could lift it without custom rigging, and the nearest harbor is 50 miles from the site, across mountain passes. The joints between the trilithon stones show no mortar, no bronze clamps, just stone on stone, with less than a millimeter of gap. Whoever placed them knew the exact angle and had control over multi-ton masses that modern construction avoids entirely. Engineers have tried to recreate the process and only partly succeeded. In 1995, a team in Egypt attempted to move a 35-ton obelisk using Bronze Age tools and wooden sledges. They managed 300 feet before the sledge splintered under repeated friction. The Baalbek stones are 23 times heavier. A 2013 experiment used 50 workers pulling a 2-ton block on dry sand. It moved, but required constant re-wetting and path maintenance to prevent the sledge from digging in. Scaling that effort to 800 tons would need 20,000 laborers in synchronized motion, and the path from quarry to platform rises 20 feet in elevation. The biggest problem wasn't distance, but precision. Modern cranes can lift heavy loads, but setting an 800-ton block into a pre-cut socket with millimeter tolerance requires control no rope and lever system has successfully demonstrated. One recent theory finally closed part of the gap the experiments couldn't. In 2014, a physics team at the University of Amsterdam showed that wetting sand directly in front of a sledge reduces drag by 50%. Tomb paintings at Jehutihotep show a worker pouring liquid ahead of a sledge, a detail dismissed for decades as ceremonial. Residue analysis on ramp sites in Egypt found traces of gypsum and clay mixed with water, which hardens into a low-friction surface once dry. The theory works for transport, but it doesn't explain lifting. Ramps at Baalbek would need to stretch over 400 feet to reach the platform at a usable grade, and no ramp remnants have been found near the trilithon. Tool marks on the stones suggest they were rotated during placement, but the mechanism for rotation under that weight remains unknown. The current best guess combines water-lubricated sledges, temporary earthen ramps, and some kind of pivoting technique using counterweights or fulcrums. It accounts for the evidence, but leaves the final lift unresolved. The next mystery has no stones at all, only a disease with no known cause. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to dance. She had no music, she gave no explanation, she simply moved, and she did not stop. By the end of the first week, dozens of others had joined her, dancing through the heat with no rest and no apparent choice in the matter. Within a month, city accounts put the number near 400 people moving through the streets day and night. Some danced until their feet bled. Physicians of the time reported cases of people collapsing from exhaustion, and some accounts describe dancers dying, their hearts giving out under the strain. City records from the time describe it with a plainness that makes it more unsettling, not less. Strasbourg kept meticulous civic records, and the dancing plague shows up in them the way a grain shortage or a tax dispute would, logged as a real event that city officials had to manage. Physicians were formally consulted, and their notes survive. Their diagnosis at the time was hot blood, a physical imbalance they believed could be cured by more dancing, not less. So the city response was to build stages, hire musicians, and encourage the afflicted to keep moving. That approach made things worse. Contemporary chronicles describe the epidemic peaking in August before finally fading, with local authorities eventually banning music and dancing outright and sending the remaining sufferers to a shrine for prayer instead. Modern doctors have proposed causes ranging from poison to psychology, and neither fully fits. The poison theory points to ergot, a fungus that grows on damp rye and produces compounds chemically related to LSD. Strasbourg's grain supply that year came largely from low-lying, flood-prone fields, exactly where ergot thrives, and ergot poisoning is a documented cause of convulsions and hallucinations. But ergot poisoning typically restricts blood flow and makes sustained, coordinated movement difficult, not easier. It's hard to reconcile with people dancing continuously for days. The alternative theory is mass psychogenic illness, a stress-induced episode spreading through a population already gripped by famine, disease, and religious fear. Strasbourg had all three in 1518, but psychogenic outbreaks rarely produce the physical toll described here, including reported deaths. No formal cause was ever established, and the case remains open. Mass panic reappears in an even stranger form in the next case. High in a remote mountain settlement, cut off for most of the year by weather and terrain, something moved through the population like weather itself. Residents began reporting the same fear at the same moment, in different homes, with no shared meal, no shared water source, nothing to explain how it jumped from person to person. Some described a presence in the room. Others simply froze, unable to speak, convinced something was about to happen to them. Neighbors who'd never had a psychiatric episode in their lives were suddenly certain they were about to die, all within the same handful of days. Local authorities called in outside help, expecting a simple case of nerves or bad water. What they found instead was a community that couldn't agree on what they'd seen, only that they'd all seen something. Investigators who visited the village came away with more questions than they arrived with. The label researchers eventually reached for was folie à plusieurs, shared delusion, a rare condition where a psychological disturbance in one person spreads to those closest to them through suggestion and trust rather than any biological cause. It's mostly documented in isolated pairs, a parent and child, 2 siblings. A whole village, fitting the pattern, was almost unheard of. Investigators looked at the obvious pressures. The village had been snowed in for weeks. Food stores were thin, sleep was broken, and the isolation meant every roomer had nowhere to go but back and forth between the same handful of houses. That combination, poor nutrition, exhaustion, and total social enclosure, made a convincing enough case file. The report was filed, the symptoms stopped within the month, and the village returned to its routines. One detail in the case file was never folded into any tidy explanation. Several residents, questioned separately and without knowing what the others had said, described the same specific sound in the moments before the fear hit them. Not a scream, not wind through the buildings, but something closer to a low knock, 3 times, from somewhere with no clear source. Investigators checked pipework, loose shutters, livestock, anything that could produce a repeating, 3-part sound on cue. Nothing in the village matched it. Shared delusion can explain synchronized fear. It doesn't easily explain a dozen strangers independently describing the same specific noise. The file was closed anyway, the sound noted but never accounted for, filed alongside a diagnosis that never quite covered every detail on the page. The next mystery isn't about a village, but a single object that shouldn't exist at all. In 1938, near Baghdad, archaeologists pulled a small clay jar out of the ground. Inside was a copper cylinder, and inside that, an iron rod, all sealed together with asphalt. It looked unremarkable. It was anything but. The design dates back roughly 2,000 years, long before anyone on record understood electric current. But strip away the age, and the structure matches a basic wet cell battery almost part for part. Copper anode, iron cathode, a container built to hold an acidic liquid between them. Historians have debated it for decades, some calling it coincidence, others calling it evidence of forgotten technology. Nobody could settle it just by staring at the object, so eventually, someone decided to actually build one and see what happened. Replicas of the object were actually built and tested, and they worked. Researchers filled reconstructed versions with grape juice, vinegar, even copper sulfate solution, anything acidic enough to react with the metals. The results weren't subtle. Some replicas produced close to a volt, enough to give a small, measurable shock, and enough to electroplate a thin layer of metal onto an object. That's not a rounding error. That's a functioning battery, built from a design 2,000 years old, doing exactly what a battery is supposed to do. Suddenly, a jar in a museum case looked a lot less like pottery and a lot more like a power source. And yet, working doesn't mean used. No wiring has ever been found nearby. No devices, no light bulbs, nothing from the era that needed electricity to run. The object proves it could generate current. It doesn't prove anyone ever asked it to. A far more boring explanation has just as much evidence behind it. Scholars pushing the mundane theory point to something simple: scrolls. Papyrus documents from the region were sometimes stored in sealed tubes to protect them from moisture, and the layered metal and asphalt construction would do that job just as well as it would generate a charge. Under that reading, the copper cylinder isn't an electrode, it's a case. The iron rod isn't a cathode. It's a rod a fragile document could be wound around, kept dry and intact for centuries in a Mesopotamian climate that destroys parchment fast. Both explanations fit the physical evidence. Neither one has ever been confirmed by anything written down, any diagram, any surviving instructions. So the object sits in a case, technically capable of two completely different lives, and historians still can't agree which one it actually lived. The next artifact raises the same question on a much larger scale: an entire mechanism, not just one part. In 1901, sponge divers working off the coast of Antikythera, Greece, pulled up a lump of corroded bronze from a shipwreck. It had been underwater for over 2,000 years. When it dried, fragments began to split apart, and someone noticed shapes inside. Gears. Dozens of them, cut with a precision that didn't belong anywhere near the 1st century BC. The shipwreck dated to around 70 BC, carrying wine jars, glassware, and statues. This mechanism was cargo, not part of the ship. It had been built deliberately, transported carefully, and then lost when the vessel went down. The gears were bronze, each tooth shaped by hand, stacked in layers, with axles running through them. For decades, no one could explain what it was for. The fragments were too corroded, too fragile to take apart. Some thought it was an astrolabe. Others dismissed it as modern contamination, impossible for ancient Greece. It would take over a century and X-ray technology to understand what those gears were counting. CT scans in 2005 revealed inscriptions hidden inside the corrosion. Over 3,000 characters of text. Instructions. The mechanism tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and planets through the zodiac. It calculated lunar phases down to the hour. It predicted solar and lunar eclipses years in advance using the Saros cycle, a 223-month pattern known to Babylonian astronomers, but never before seen in a physical device. One dial counted the 4-year Olympic cycle. Another tracked the Metonic calendar, a 19-year pattern that reconciles lunar months with solar years. You turned a crank on the side, and the gears moved forward or backward through time. The oldest known analog computer, built with differential gearing that wouldn't reappear in European clocks until the 14th century. Researchers have built working replicas. The math checks out. The engineering is flawless, but the mechanism itself names no maker, no city, no patron who commissioned it. No workshop or inventor has ever been confidently linked to building it. The leading theory points to Rhodes, a hub of astronomy and mechanics in the Hellenistic period. The philosopher Posidonius is sometimes named, though no source confirms he built anything like this. Others suggest Archimedes, who died 130 years before the shipwreck, but whose writings describe planetary models that match the mechanism's design. Cicero mentioned a device that showed the motions of the heavens, built by Archimedes, lost when Syracuse fell. What unsettles historians isn't just that the Antikythera mechanism existed, it's that it seems to have no ancestors and no descendants. If this level of engineering was possible in 100 BC, where are the others? No similar gears have been recovered from any Roman or Greek site. Either this was a singular genius working alone, or the knowledge was widespread and simply didn't survive. Bronze corrodes, wood rots, parchment burns. If one shipwreck preserved this, how many workshops, libraries, and entire traditions were lost without a trace? The mechanism proves that ancient technology could reach heights we didn't think possible, then disappear so completely that later generations had to reinvent it from scratch. If technology like this could vanish, so could an entire civilization. And the next mystery is exactly that. Around 2600 BC, in the river valleys of what's now Pakistan and northwest India, a civilization rose that rivaled Egypt and Mesopotamia in scale. At its peak, the Indus Valley civilization supported over 1,000 settlements and cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, home to tens of thousands of people each. Then, sometime after 1900 BC, within a span archaeologists measure in mere decades, the great cities emptied out. There's no ash layer pointing to invasion, no mass graves suggesting slaughter, no burned palaces. The wells still had usable stonework. The granaries still stood. People simply stopped living in them, and smaller, scattered settlements appeared elsewhere instead. The scale of what was left behind doesn't match any story of a slow ending. What makes the disappearance harder to explain is just how sophisticated these cities were. Mohenjo-daro had covered drains running beneath nearly every street, connected to individual household bathrooms, a sanitation system some cities in Europe wouldn't match for another 3,500 years. Bricks across the entire civilization, from Gujarat to the foothills of the Himalayas, were made to the same standardized ratio, 4:2:1. That kind of uniformity, spread across a region larger than Western Europe, points to shared authority or shared knowledge passed down with real precision. Trade goods turn up hundreds of miles from where they were made. Carnelian beads, seals stamped with unknown symbols, weights calibrated so consistently that a merchant in one city could trust a transaction in another. A culture this organized doesn't usually vanish for simple reasons. River and climate data would eventually point to a specific culprit. Sediment cores pulled from the region tell a quieter story than invasion or plague. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which many of these cities depended on, appears to have weakened and shifted course, possibly tied to changes in monsoon patterns starting around 2000 BC. Without reliable water, irrigation collapsed. Farming that had sustained cities of 40,000 people or more could no longer keep pace, and populations didn't die, they dispersed, moving east toward the Ganges Plain in smaller, more self-sufficient groups. It's a slow, almost mundane ending for a civilization that built the ancient world's most advanced plumbing. But one mystery survived the migration intact. The Indus script, stamped on thousands of seals, has never been translated. No bilingual inscription, no Rosetta Stone. The people scattered, but their writing stayed behind, and no one has ever read it. Go further west, to the same civilization, and the mystery only deepens. Egypt gave us hieroglyphs and a key to unlock them. The Indus Valley left something stranger, a script found on seals, pottery, and tiny tablets. Most inscriptions no longer than a few characters. Over 4,000 objects carry this writing, scattered across sites in modern Pakistan and India. More than 400 distinct symbols show up, some just once, others hundreds of times, with no clear pattern of grammar that anyone's been able to pin down. For over a century, scholars have stared at these marks, unable to agree if they're even a full language or just a system of symbols, trademarks, or religious icons. Some of the smartest cryptographers in history have tried and walked away empty-handed. In the 1960s, a team of Finnish and Soviet researchers ran the symbols through early computers, hoping raw processing power could spot patterns the human eye had missed. They found repeating sequences, sure signs of structure, but no way to attach meaning to any of it. Linguists tried comparing the script to Dravidian languages still spoken in southern India today, betting on a cultural through line. Others pushed a Sanskrit connection instead, certain the answer lay with Indo-European roots. Every camp published papers. Every camp claimed partial breakthroughs. and every single proposed translation, when tested against new inscriptions, fell apart. The reason may be more basic than anyone wants to admit. Cracking a lost script usually takes long, connected texts, something like the Rosetta Stone, where the same message repeats in a known language. The Indus script offers nothing like that. The average inscription runs about 5 symbols. The longest ever found is 26. Modern decipherment leans on statistics, patterns that only emerge across thousands of words in context. With a total surviving vocabulary that may be smaller than a single paragraph of English, there may simply not be enough material left to work with, no matter how advanced the method. Some researchers now argue the puzzle isn't unsolved, it's unsolvable, permanently, by the numbers alone. The next case isn't about a language that can't be read, but a monument no one can explain the purpose of. In southern England, 80 sarsen stones stand in a circle. Each one weighs 25 tons. The tallest reach 30 feet. They were raised 4,500 years ago by people who left no written record, no metal tools, and no evidence of a population large enough to move them. The inner ring holds smaller blue stones, 43 of them, each weighing 2 to 5 tons. The precision is unsettling. Lintels balanced on uprights with mortise and tenon joints, stone shaped to fit stone. The ground shows post holes, cremation pits, and ditches dug in phases over 1,500 years. No settlement nearby could have supported the labor. No quarry close enough to explain the transport. For centuries, the origin of the stones was assumed to be local. Then geologists tested the rock. Recent geological tracing found exactly where these stones came from, and it raised more questions than it answered. Geochemical analysis matched the blue stones to outcrops in the Presiceli Hills of Wales, 140 miles away. The sarsen stones came from West Woods in Wiltshire, 15 miles north. That means the builders moved 43 stones, weighing multiple tons each, across rivers, hills, and open ground, without wheels or draft animals. One proposed route involves rafts on the Bristol Channel, then overland sledges on timber rollers. Experimental archaeology teams tried it in 2000. They moved a single bluestone replica 1 mile in 2 weeks, using 130 people. Extrapolating that effort to 43 stones over 140 miles requires thousands of worker days, coordinated across generations. The construction itself demanded astronomical alignment. The heel stone marks the midsummer sunrise. The station stones form a rectangle aligned to lunar extremes. Whoever built this knew the sky. They planned in advance. They had a reason compelling enough to justify decades of labor. Moving them was only half the mystery. Nobody agrees on why. One theory holds it was a healing sanctuary. Excavations in 2008 uncovered skeletal remains showing signs of injury and disease, some from as far as the Mediterranean. Chemical analysis of tooth enamel confirmed travelers came hundreds of miles. Bluestones were believed to have curative properties in Welsh folklore, recorded centuries later. The competing theory frames it as an ancestral monument. Cremated remains of at least 63 individuals were found in the Aubrey Holes, dated between 3000 and 2500 BCE. Many showed signs of elite status. The site aligns with a nearby processional avenue leading to the River Avon, suggesting ritual movement between the living world and the dead. Both theories have physical evidence. Both fit fragments of the archaeological record. Neither explains the full scope of construction, the choice of stone, or the centuries of modification. Stonehenge remains a monument built for a purpose we can describe, but not prove. The next site raises the same argument, but with bodies that shouldn't be there at all. In 1968, a team surveying a lake bed in southern Australia found a skeleton half buried in sand. They named her Mungo Lady, and standard tests placed her burial at around 20,000 years old. That alone would have been remarkable. but it wasn't the number that caused the argument. In the decades after, researchers went back to the same site and found more remains, including a man whose bones showed signs of ritual burial, sprinkled with red ochre, carried from miles away. Later analysis using a different dating method pushed the age far higher, possibly past 40,000 years. That range would place people in that part of Australia thousands of years before most migration models say humans had even reached the continent. Two separate dating techniques, applied to the same ground, landed on numbers that didn't just disagree. They pointed to two different versions of human history. If the dating holds up, it would rewrite when people are believed to have arrived there at all. The dispute centers on how you date sand instead of bone. Researchers used a method called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures when grains of sediment were last exposed to sunlight. It's a solid technique, but it depends entirely on undisturbed layers, and the Mungo site had been through wind, water, and shifting dunes for tens of thousands of years. One team stood by the older date, arguing the sediment sequence was intact and the numbers held up under repeated testing. Critics pushed back, suggesting the burial could have been dug down into older layers long after the fact, making the surrounding sand far older than the bones themselves. Neither side has produced evidence that fully closes the case. Radiocarbon testing on the bones themselves has come back with a younger, more conventional age, deepening the disagreement rather than resolving it. Until the dispute settles, an entire chapter of human migration stays unwritten. If the older date is ever confirmed beyond doubt, the timeline for how and when humans spread out of Africa and into the Pacific would need to be redrawn. It would mean people crossed open water to reach Australia far earlier than most models allow, using boats or rafts with no surviving trace. An entire leg of the human journey, currently missing from the record, would have to be filled in from almost nothing. For now, Mungo Lady and Mungo Man remain some of the oldest ritually buried humans ever found, regardless of which date turns out to be right. The ochre on the bones still points to grief, or reverence, or both, carried out by people whose exact place in history is still being argued over. That much survives the dispute, even if the timeline doesn't. The next mystery isn't about when people arrived, but why an entire population appears to have vanished at once. Rapa Nui, known as Easter Island, once sustained thousands. Pollen records and archaeological surveys confirm that by 1200 CE, the population had grown large enough to carve, move, and erect nearly 900 moai across the island. Then the numbers fell. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, fewer than 3,000 people remained, and the civilization that had built the statues was already gone. The collapse happened fast. Within a span of roughly 200 years, the complex society that had organized labor, developed a writing system, and commanded resources across the island, fractured and emptied. Villages were abandoned, statue production halted mid-carving, and the survivors lived among ruins they no longer had the capacity to maintain. No invasion explains it. No sudden natural disaster left a clear mark in the geological record. The population just dwindled, and the infrastructure fell silent. The famous stone giants they left behind outlasted almost everything else about them. Sediment cores drilled from the island's crater lakes tell the ecological story. Pollen analysis shows that Rapa Nui was once covered in dense palm forest, the kind that could provide timber, rope fiber, and food. By 1500 CE, those trees were gone. The forest didn't thin gradually over centuries. It vanished in what looks like a few generations of aggressive clearing. Without trees, the soil eroded, crop yields dropped. The logs and rope needed to move moai were no longer available, and statue production stopped entirely. Rat bones found in the archaeological layers suggest the Polynesian rat, introduced by settlers, devoured palm seeds faster than the forest could regenerate. The combination was lethal. This deforestation collapse model became the textbook case for ecological suicide, a society that consumed its own resources past the point of recovery. The timeline matched, the evidence stacked up, and for decades it stood as the explanation. A newer theory challenges almost everything this explanation assumes. Skeletal remains from the contact period show lesions consistent with introduced infectious disease, not malnutrition. Spanish and Dutch ships made brief stops in the 1700s, and the records note that crew members went ashore. Within 50 years of sustained European contact, the population had collapsed to under 1,000. Smallpox, syphilis, and tuberculosis all appear in the bone record. Historical accounts also document slave raids. Peruvian ships took over 1,500 islanders in the 1860s, many of them the remaining chiefs and literate priests who held the culture's oral and written knowledge. Most died overseas, and the 15 who returned brought more disease. The social structure didn't just erode, it was torn apart. Some researchers now argue the ecological collapse was real but survivable, and that it was contact, not deforestation, that delivered the fatal blow. Others maintain both forces worked together, that a weakened society had no resilience left when disease arrived. The debate hasn't settled, and the evidence supports pieces of both narratives. The next case has no split opinion, just a total, unexplained silence in the historical record. For over a decade, this person's movements were tracked in exhaustive detail. Court records, personal letters, official decrees, the kind of paper trail that lets historians reconstruct entire years, day by day. Then, without warning, the documentation simply stops. No death record, no burial, no formal announcement of retirement, exile, or transfer of power. The administrative machine that had logged every meeting and every signature for years never mentions what happened next. Contemporary writers who should have covered it, people whose job was to record exactly this kind of event, say nothing. Later chroniclers, working decades afterward, either skip the gap entirely or offer contradictory guesses dressed up as fact. Historians have combed archives across 3 countries, looking for a follow-up that was never filed. The last known record ends mid-sentence, and nothing definitive follows it. The final entry was routine, a tax dispute, a minor land grant. Nothing that reads like an ending. That's part of what makes it unsettling. Whoever wrote it had no idea it would be the last word history ever got. The timing lines up with a period of serious political instability. A rival faction was consolidating power. Old allegiances were being tested, and at least 2 other officials from the same circle vanish from the record within the same 2-year window. Some historians have pointed to purges that were common under the regime, campaigns to erase political enemies, not just physically, but administratively, scrubbing names from ledgers and correspondence. If that happened here, the silence wouldn't be an accident of preservation, it would be the point. Others aren't convinced a purge explains it, since the vanishing is too total, too clean, even for a regime skilled at erasing people. One theory, only recently taken seriously by historians, would explain the silence completely. That theory involves defection, not disappearance. Recently cross-referenced trade records from a neighboring territory show a name, title, and estimated arrival date that line up almost exactly with the gap. If accurate, this wasn't an erasure. It was someone choosing to vanish. The logic holds up. Defecting to a rival power during a purge would explain why the home records go silent and why no death or retirement was ever logged. Officials who fled weren't mourned. They were erased on purpose, their names struck from future documents as a kind of punishment. It's a compelling case, but the foreign record is a single fragmentary entry, damaged and partially illegible. No second source has ever confirmed it, and historians remain split between defection, purge, and simple accident of lost paperwork. Whatever the truth, this case gets closer to an answer than almost anything else on this list. One mystery is left, and it's the one this entire video has been building toward. The final case on this list starts with a logbook kept by a researcher who'd spent years chasing one thread through the others on this list. The entries are careful, dated, methodical, right up until the last page. Mid-sentence, the handwriting just stops. No signature, no explanation, no sign of struggle. The team that found the log tried to retrace the researcher's last route using notes left behind, coordinates scrawled in the margins, a handful of receipts. It took months, and it led to a location nobody on the team expected. Local records showed nothing unusual there. No accidents, no disappearances, nothing on file at all. But when investigators finally reached the spot marked in those last legible notes, they didn't find a person. What they found at the very last location wasn't what anyone expected, and it's the piece that ties everything else together. What they found was a small cache of objects, cataloged but never reported, matching materials pulled from 3 separate sites earlier in this list. The same mineral traces, the same tool marks, sites separated by hundreds of miles, and in some cases, thousands of years. That shouldn't be possible under any conventional timeline. And yet here it was. Physical evidence, linking cases that mainstream researchers had always treated as unrelated coincidences. The dates didn't just overlap, they clustered, again and again, around the same narrow windows. The researcher had flagged this in the margins too, circled dates, question marks, stacked next to site names. Whoever kept that log wasn't just documenting mysteries, they were hunting for the thing connecting them. One researcher believed all of it pointed to a single, uncomfortable answer. The theory is this, that these sites, spread across continents and centuries, aren't separate mysteries at all. They're fragments of one lost body of knowledge, technical, practical, passed between cultures that had no obvious contact, then interrupted before it could be written down in a form that survived. It would explain the shared tool marks. It would explain construction techniques that show up in places too far apart to have copied each other by any route historians can trace. And it would explain why so many of these cases end the same way, not with an answer, but with the record simply going quiet. Researchers who back this idea point to matching material signatures across at least 4 sites on this very list, evidence that's hard to wave off as coincidence. It's the closest thing this field has to a unifying answer. But even this theory has a hole in it that no one has been able to close. Here's the problem. At least 3 of those 4 matching sites date to periods separated by more than 200 years, too far apart for a single event or a single group to explain. If the material really does connect them, something carried that knowledge forward for 2 centuries without leaving a single written trace. No teacher, no text, no named tradition. Skeptics call that the theory's fatal flaw. Believers call it proof the story is bigger than anyone's willing to admit. Carbon dating on the newest site keeps coming back with a range wide enough to fit either argument, so the debate just resets every time someone reruns the test. Committees still labeled it a leading theory in journals. The raw data underneath just refuses to agree with itself, which leaves only one honest place to end this story. 21 cases, 21 records that stop mid-sentence, whether that sentence was carved in stone, buried in ash, or simply left off the page entirely. Some sites gave up their secrets down to the smallest detail, the tools, the diet, the last meal, and still couldn't explain the one moment that mattered. Others gave up almost nothing at all, just a silence so complete it became its own kind of evidence. Every generation of researchers arrives certain their instruments will finally close the file. Every generation leaves a little more humbled than the last. with a few new questions added to the ones they came to answer. What survives isn't an answer. It's the record itself. The pottery shards, the abandoned tools, the half-finished walls that someone meant to come back to and never did. That's what actually changed. These cases forced historians to admit that not knowing isn't a failure of the method. It's sometimes the most honest conclusion the evidence allows. That shift in humility outlasted every individual theory this list has burned through. The sites are still there, the questions are still open, and somewhere a researcher is packing equipment for one more trip to try to close them. Take the Antikythera mechanism. When divers pulled it from a shipwreck off Greece in 1901, it looked like a corroded lump of bronze, nothing worth a second glance. It took X-ray imaging almost a century later to reveal 30 interlocking gears, designed to track the moon's phase and predict eclipses years in advance. Nothing that precise shows up again in the historical record for over 1,000 years. Whoever built it either had a tradition of clockwork engineering that left zero other trace, or stumbled onto a one-off design that died with them. The Baghdad battery raises a similar problem. It's a clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, dated to somewhere between 250 BC and 250 AD. Modern replicas filled with vinegar or grape juice do produce a small electric charge, under 2 volts. The debate isn't whether it can generate current, it's whether anyone 2,000 years ago had a reason to want one. Then there's the Nazca lines in southern Peru, over 800 straight lines and 300 geometric shapes carved into the desert floor between 500 BC and 500 AD. Some stretch more than 30 miles. The strange part is scale. Most of these figures are too large to recognize from the ground. You need altitude, hundreds of feet of it, to see the hummingbird or the spider take shape. The Nazca had no aircraft, no hot air balloons on record, so either the lines weren't meant to be seen as pictures at all, or someone found a vantage point we haven't identified. Baffling metallurgy shows up again with the Wootz steel blades of ancient India and Sri Lanka, prized across the medieval world for edges that stayed sharp through repeated combat. Under a microscope, the steel shows carbon nanotubes, a structure nobody could have understood in the 3rd century BC. The technique vanished by the 1700s, and modern metallurgists still can't fully reproduce the original process. And in 1518, Strasbourg recorded something stranger than any weapon or machine. A woman named Frau Trophea began dancing in the street and didn't stop. Within a month, contemporary records list around 400 people dancing alongside her, some reportedly to the point of exhaustion or death. Physicians at the time blamed hot blood and prescribed more dancing, which only fed the outbreak. If any of these 21 stayed with you, there are more cases just like them waiting. Subscribe, and we'll keep digging into the ones history still can't explain.